All right, well, I think the numbers have slowed down, so why don't we go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our monthly COSSA headlines. I'm Wendy Noss, COSSA's Executive Director, and I'm joined by our team, Elise and Kenzie. I think many of you have been tuning in each month, and so what we hope to do today is to pick up where we left off and talk about some of the things that are happening in Washington right now, and specifically focus on the budget. We know there's a lot happening with executive orders and on the administration side, and we're happy to answer questions about that. But as you'll see in a little bit, we are smack dab in the middle of appropriations and budget season right now, and so we wanted to prioritize that. If this is your first time here, so COSSA is an advocacy organization in Washington, D.C., and we advocate for social and behavioral science research, usually for funding for agencies that we all care about, National Science Foundation, NIH, Census Bureau, and dozens of others. But we also protect the social and behavioral sciences from attacks, cuts, challenges to the scientific workforce, things like that. So as you might imagine, we're quite busy, as I'm sure all of you are too. And you're all here because you're affiliated with one of these organizations on the screen. And this is really COSSA's worst kept secret or best kept secret, but worst trait, which is anyone affiliated with any one of these organizations can participate in COSSA activities. And so please spread the word to others, either at your university or with your membership of your scientific society. And folks can sign up, and you are already COSSA members. So please spread the word, especially during these challenging times when we need to get the word out. So like I said, I'm going to focus today on the budget. And I'm going to talk about where we are currently, and then where we should be going forward. But of course, everything is in flux right now. So talk a little bit about that. I know that there's a lot of rumors out there. There's a lot of concern about science funding and research agencies and how they're going to fare over the next year, couple of years. And so know that COSSA is here working on this in Washington with all of our partners, but I also want to encourage you all to stay informed and learn what is real, what is not real. And that's part of my goal today, is to clarify some things. So let's talk about first current year funding. So fiscal year 2025 actually began on October 1st of last year, and the process wasn't completed until about 15 days ago or so. And you'll be hearing a lot about the CR, continuing resolution. You'll be hearing terms like budget reconciliation. You'll hear about fiscal year 2025, 2026, and so on. So hopefully I can explain this clearly so you understand what's really going on. But right now we're sitting in fiscal year 2025, and nearly 6 months into the fiscal year, Congress finally finished the budget. While it's not unusual that Congress is delayed in these activities, it's actually become the norm. Rarely do we see appropriations bills completed by October 1st. But what's different this time around is the method they use to complete their funding. Because of the paralyzing partisanship in Congress, as that has been growing over time, but is really starting to peak right now, Congress could not come to agreement on final fiscal year funding levels for 2025. And so what they did was pass a continuing resolution, or a CR, that extends fiscal year 2024 funding for the rest of the year. So in this table, you can see what the 2024 enacted levels were. And now the enacted 2025 CR, in most cases, is flat funding for agencies that we care about. You'll notice a small decrease for the NIH, but that was not a targeted decrease. That was something having to do with mandatory money through the 21st Century Cures Act. So that wasn't sort of a purposeful decrease, but more of a scheduled thing. So CRs are common. Even sometimes we see full year continuing resolutions. But what's different this time around is we don't have the level of detail that we usually get from Congress on how federal agencies are supposed to spend the money that they just appropriated. So, for example, the National Science Foundation will be flat funded for the rest of this year at $9.1 billion. But usually, appropriations bills come with a report attached to it. You'll hear things like report language thrown around. And that is a second document that essentially is an instruction guide to the agencies on how Congress expects the agency to spend that money. Because Congress enacted a year-long continuing resolution, all we really have are top-line budget numbers. We don't have the report that goes with it explaining Congress's intent for that funding. So what that means for all of us is that right now, the agencies have something like 45 days, so a couple of weeks left, to write their spend plans, so detail how they will spend their appropriation and send that back to Congress. And then Congress can approve that. They don't have to vote on it, but there can be some back and forth and additional rescissions. This is problematic for a couple of reasons. One being that typically for many federal agencies, especially NIH, the appropriations reports go into a lot of detail. They stipulate how much money each NIH institute and center should receive. Some accounts go down to the program level and include specific funding amounts for specific programs. So what we have now is an agency given a top line chunk of money, but having to decide how to spend that, which seems like that would be great, except those spend plans have to go through the White House and the Office of Management and Budget. And we all know that they are looking to cut everything right now. So essentially what has happened is a layer of politics has been added to the appropriations process for fiscal year 2025. And so you'll see some NAs in this table, and that is because it is not clear what some of these sub-agencies might receive in fiscal year 2025, because those agencies received their top line appropriation but haven't yet decided how they would spend that. So an example is the Department of Justice, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and the National Institute of Justice. If you read the appropriations bills every year, the funding amounts for those two agencies are not in the bill themselves, typically. They're in the report that accompanies the bill, and we don't have the report. So it doesn't mean that those are zeroed out, but it means the agency has sole discretion on how to fund that this year. So I hope that makes sense. What it really means is we won't know the full impact of fiscal year 25 funding for a couple of weeks because it has to go through this political process now to see where things end up. All that being said, fiscal year 25 turned out okay. Flat funding in this environment is quite an accomplishment. So it's good news. And it might these levels might actually be the high watermark for a couple of years. So just keep that in mind going forward, at least for the next few years, that flat funding is the new up, and we need to be okay with flat funding. That would be a significant win for science agencies. Okay, another important point about the CR is, and one of the reasons it was being held up so long, was obviously the Democrats and Republicans could not come to agreement on funding levels, but in addition, Democrats were trying to get language included in the bill that would protect agencies from the president's many executive orders. While on the other hand, Republicans were trying to codify a lot of the executive orders into law. So none of that made it in there, which is good. But on the Democratic side, there are no protections in the bill that would stop the president, for example, from in their spend plans from eliminating additional DEI activities or other things that they don't agree with, as an example.
Wendy, there's a question in the chat.
Yeah.
From Daniel Bass. How will we find out about the FY25 funding for those NA agencies such as IFLE and Department of Education?
Yes, that is a great question. So unfortunately, spend plans are not public documents. They're from the agency to the Congress. The best way to know quickly is to, if you have contacts within those agencies, ask them. They won't know yet. But once the spend plans are approved, which could be another several weeks, so we're talking a month or so down the line now, once they're complete, they should be able to share those publicly or at least tell you what their funding level is. The other way you'll know, and this is where we'll turn to next, is when the president releases his budget request for next year, it will include the final enacted number for 2025. So you'll have some things to compare it to. But this is really unprecedented in my 20 plus years in Washington of how they finished these bills, and really the question marks that still surround a final appropriation. Usually you close the book on that fiscal year, you know what you're working with, and you move on to next year. But we will, I think, still be having some questions for a little bit longer. And we'll, of course, as we hear from agencies, we'll update our tables and make sure everything is included in our newsletter and such. But yeah, unfortunately, there's no easy answer to that one. All right, so that's 2025. And in the minds of most people in Congress, 2025 is done. They are over it. They don't want to work on it anymore. They passed the CR and they're looking to 2026. And unfortunately, this is where most of the battles are going to be. This is where it's going to get really, really tough. And is why I said 2025 levels is probably going to be our high number for a while. You'll notice in the table that under the 2026 column for the president's budget request, there are no numbers, with the exception of the Institute of Museum and Library Services, which is 0. We don't have the president's budget request yet for next year. That usually comes out and is supposed to come out, according to law, in early February, but it's not unusual for that to be delayed, especially in presidential transition years. But we are hearing that it could be delayed until May, if not June at this point. The president's budget document is just that. It's a budget, it's a policy statement. It provides detail on, if the president had his way, how the entire government would be funded. And they go into a lot of detail about every agency, programs, etc., which is why it takes so long to develop these things. Congress does use the president's budget request to help guide how they write their appropriations bills. But remember, Congress holds the power of the purse. Their one job, if they did nothing else, is to pass 12 appropriations bills every year to fund every aspect of the government. And they hold that power. The president's budget will inform that, especially because the House and Senate are both in Republican control right now. But they typically do not simply rubber stamp the president's budget and fund it exactly the way he sees. So we're waiting to see the president's budget, but in the meantime, Congress is already beginning their work on the 2026 process. Like I said, the budget usually comes out in February, and that tends to be the official kickoff of appropriations season, followed by hearings in the Congress with federal agency heads defending the budget, and hearings to mark up legislation and so on. And that's how the process is supposed to go. But now we sort of have parallel tracks. We have a delayed president's budget request over here. And we have the appropriations committees who have finished their work on 2025 and are pushing ahead with 2026. So in a lot of ways, at least on the congressional side of things, the appropriations process is proceeding somewhat in regular order or on time. But as you can imagine, if they start writing their bills and then the president's budget request comes out, what happens then? Do they rewrite the bills? Do they ignore the president's request? It just adds a lot more complexity to this budget cycle. In addition to that, you'll be hearing, I'm sure, about budget resolutions and budget reconciliation and wondering what the heck that is and how that's different. In short, it's a complicated process that is used by Congress to achieve a very specific end. So, for example, the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, was created through a reconciliation bill. If you follow the rules and go in the sequence that it requires, it allows legislation to pass by a simple majority instead of a 2/3 vote in the Senate, which makes it filibuster proof. That's why they use it. So if we're in a position where we're in right now, where the Democratic and Republican numbers in both houses are very close, like barely 50% for the majority, you need reconciliation to happen in order to pass anything big. And the president wants to pass tax cuts. He wants to extend the 2017 tax law and make it permanent. And so using the reconciliation process to do that. And I'll show you really quick. So this is the reconciliation process. I don't expect you to read all of this, but the point here is in order to unlock the process, which allows for a simple majority for things to pass, the House and Senate have to agree on everything. They have to each enact a budget resolution, which is not signed by the president. This is just a congressional activity. But they have to pass identical budget resolutions, which sets sort of the top line money levels. So for fiscal year 2026, the federal budget is going to be X, and they both have to agree on that. After that, all the work goes to the committees in both chambers, and they will be given targets of how much money to cut. So the Science Committee will say, identify this many billions of dollars in cuts, and same with Energy and Commerce and so on down the line. These cuts are supposed to allow the tax cuts or the tax breaks to be extended. So in order to reduce the deficit without, or in order to extend tax breaks and not increase the deficit, you have to find savings somewhere else. And so that's what the reconciliation process is doing. You don't need to know all the details of that, but the point I'm trying to make here with reconciliation is that over the next couple of weeks, the House and the Senate are going to try to come to an agreement on what that top line number is for the federal budget. Once they do that, they're still a long way off from identifying other cuts, but we will know what the top line number is for fiscal year 26, which is what the appropriations bills will have to be written to. So they're separate activities in a lot of ways, but they will, in the end, come together and affect next year's budget. And this is very wonky, but what you need to know about the fiscal 2026 process is that the appropriations committees are already moving ahead without a president's budget, and they may be writing and releasing their bills in probably closer to June, July timeframe. The House Appropriations Committee chairman said he is hoping to complete their bills in the House by the August recess. Usually in the House, it's around the July 4th break. but they realize things are delayed. So that means really the best time right now to advocate for the agencies we care about is now until the early summer. In
Another
terms of the
question, Wendy,
yes,
sorry to interrupt.
yeah,
Another question from Camille Gamboa. She asked, with regard to NSF, your opinion, how likely is it that the president's request will get down to the directorate level?
it will, and it always does. Bills in Congress, so appropriations bills, typically, and this is on purpose in what we like, do not appropriate funds for each of NSF's directorates. The scientific community seems to agree that NSF should determine how much SPE gets versus bio and engineering, as opposed to political decisions by Congress. So the bills do not. But the president's budget request goes down to the directorate level, the division level, and sometimes the programmatic level too. Not that that has bearing on the appropriations bills because they don't appropriate the same way, but the president's budget, it going down to that level of detail is actually really helpful to see where they have priorities and where they don't. And so where they may, once appropriations is over and they have to write their spend plan, it gives you a little bit of insight into how they're likely to spend their money. All right, so in terms of process, this is how it's supposed to work. This is how a bill becomes a law, or at least a budget bill. But like I said, we're waiting on the president's budget request. But this week, the Congress is working to complete their budget resolutions, which will set that top line dollar amount. And it will allow the appropriations committees to start working on the details of their bills. Once they have the top line targets, they can sort of work underneath that. And so this is the best time right now to try to advocate for the funding levels that we care about in the bills, any language we want included in the bills and such. This is why we have Congressional Hill visits and lobby days this time of year, because this is when the rubber hits the road. All with an eye towards, by the end of September, having a federal budget before the October 1st new fiscal year starts. I don't think that's going to happen. I think there will definitely be a continuing resolution again into next year, or at least past October 1st. But I think many people, many pundits in Washington will tell you they're very skeptical that fiscal year 2026 will end up any different than 2025, simply because there's just very little agreement being had on anything in Congress, let alone budgets. And the margins are so close with the parties that you really need every vote you can get. So we'll see. We're a far way off from that. But the point is, we are focused right now on this chunk of time. You want to influence legislation, funding legislation before it's written. Hence why COSSA was on the Hill last week, and lots of other groups were on the Hill as well, lobbying for the agencies that they care about. I already talked about budget reconciliation. So what can you do about all of this? In past webinars, we've talked in detail about several executive actions as well. We're still very concerned about those. We're still issuing action alerts about those. But because of the timing right now, this being budget season, and we want to make our case before the bills are written, we're focusing most of our energy on the appropriations process. Grassroots action remains where it is right now. Congressional offices need to hear from their constituents about good things and bad things. So certainly they're hearing right now about impacts of the executive actions and lots of concern there. But they also need to hear about the value of social science. And that's what we used our advocacy day for last week, was to share with congressional offices that we're here to serve, that our science can help in a lot of things that they're working on in legislation and such. So grassroots action is most important in this environment. COSSA has its action center. Hopefully you've seen And we have 6 or 7 action alerts on our page right now. Usually we have one, but this is not a typical environment. This one on the screen here is our funding action alert that goes into specific detail about the amounts we're asking for the agencies we care about. And so there's a number in there for NSF and NIH and the justice agencies and education and so on. And so you can go to our Action Center, COSSA.org, and you can easily fill out a letter by entering your zip code, your address, and shooting that off to Congress. So that's one thing that you can do. We're also hearing, especially from our Hill Day last week, that congressional offices want stories from locals. They want to know positive and negative. They want to know how the executive orders are affecting things in the state and in the district. So at the local university, how many jobs were lost? How many research grants were cut? What facilities were shut down, et cetera. They want that information, and the more local, the better. And they also, we met with a lot of offices that are already sympathetic to our cause. A lot of Democratic offices told us you're preaching to the choir, which we knew. But what they want from us are stories as well, or positive anecdotes for how they can help combat from within the Congress. So what is the value of social and behavioral science? Is there a good example from the state or from the university where something has really made a difference? Helping them understand and then articulate it to others, and have our champions in Congress advocate on our behalf from within the Congress is what they're looking for. And so any way that you can measure impact of research, impact of education locally, how many graduate students are engaged in this research, how many jobs does it produce, how much funding is received, anything like that, Congress wants those specifics. And there's lots of ways that you can give them to them, either by engaging with them directly, calling a congressional office, and we have resources to help you do that. Or there are, if you follow COSSA's reporting and you're signed up for the COSSA Washington Update, our newsletter that goes out every other Tuesday, we include in that places where you can submit stories like these. Different committees in the House and Senate have portals that they've created where you can confidentially share stories like this. And scientific societies are also collecting this information. So anything you can do to help quantify or measure impact of our research is going to help along the way as we make the case. So a quick word about our Advocacy Day. Last week, we had almost 75 social science researchers, faculty, graduate students, undergraduate students, deans, all in Washington at the same time to meet with their elected officials. We had 16, I think 17 states represented, and almost 70 meetings across the country on both sides of the aisle. And while they have a shared message in these meetings to use social science as a resource, each meeting was unique. Because the social sciences are unique. The different disciplines bring something different. And so each meeting talked about either the concerns with the executive orders. They each asked the congressional office, what can the social sciences do to help you? What are the challenges that your office is facing right now? Because chances are a social scientist is out there who can help you with that challenge. And so interestingly, here's a quick word cloud of some of the feedback we got from congressional offices. So like I said, every meeting was different because some had criminologists in their group, some had economists, some had psychologists. And so everyone sort of built their own meeting based on their expertise. But they were all asked to inquire, how can the social sciences help? Or at least, what are you most concerned with, Congressman X? And the greatest number of responses was for generally economic impact of federal agency cuts. So budget cuts, so cancellation of grants, the indirect costs, 15% issue at NIH, the reductions in force, the RIFs, which are the federal workforce layoffs, those came in as a top priority to a lot of congressional offices as the top issue. Behind that was health. So healthcare, biomedical research, just concerns with health, especially with cuts to propose for NIH. What does that mean for cures and diagnostics and things like that? Research funding was also up there for obvious reasons, because research is being cut in real time. And education was sort of the fourth most popular, and that's not surprising, given that the executive order on closing the Department of Education had come out just a few days before that. So we do these word clouds every year, and it's always interesting to see where the priorities lie. It's a lot of the same issues, but the priorities change year to year. So last year, artificial intelligence was at the top. And you can just see how offices are adjusting to the times. But it also shows just how important it is that we're communicating with these offices about the things that they care about. So about budget cuts for agencies, about health, about research funding, and so on. Because if they say these are their priorities, let's take yes for an answer and give them information to help them do their job and advocate on our behalf. So that is what you can do. You can also, right now, I know many of you are either work for or are members of other associations or scientific societies, and I know that they're all doing whatever they can on behalf of their community. If they're issuing action alerts or calling for the collection of stories, please consider responding to those, because again, grassroots is where all of the difference is going to be had here. As lobbyists in Washington, Kenzie and I can meet with these people all the time, and we do. But they will ask, well, what does this mean for my local economy? Or what does this mean for the citizens in my district? And so you can speak to that, and they're asking you to. So I hope that you will. So I'm going to stop there. We have a lot of time for questions. Wanted you to save the date. We'll continue this discussion. We'll know more about the budget on April 29th. And so you'll see a registration link for that. And then here are some just notable links. The COSSA Washington update will come out tomorrow. So if you are signed up and you don't see it tomorrow, check your spam filters. And otherwise, you can sign up for that. And any of you, because you're on this webinar, you are technically a COSSA member. You can also sign up for COSSA member messages. And those are more timely updates like action alerts and things that we send to our members first. And of course, we're all over social. So here's our contact information and how to encourage others to join, and whysocialscience.com, where we post a lot of stories as well. So I'm going to stop here so I can see everybody, and happy to go into more discussion or give you time back. So Kenzie, I'm going to let you manage this. Feel free to raise your hands or unmute your line. I wanted to say one other thing. So I think the subtext behind Camille's question about NSF's budget and the president's budget request is there are rumors that the budget requests for NSF could zero out the Social Behavioral and Economic Sciences Directorate. I've heard those rumors. I've talked with leadership within NSF. I don't like to spread rumors, that are not substantiated. So I don't want, to make the rumor mill worse. What I will say is, I wouldn't be surprised if the president's budget sought to zero out SBE, because it is perfectly in line with his overall messaging. And that's where this administration thinks a lot of the grants that they have a problem with come from. That's actually not true. Just given the size of SBE and what they fund, very little of that is coming from SBE. That's point number one. It wouldn't surprise me. Point number two, though, is because the president's budget is going to be so delayed and Congress is going to start working anyway. Practically speaking, it will be hard for SBE to be zeroed out. There's not a lot of time. If the president's budget came out in February like it normally does, and Congress wrote his bills by July, that's a lot of time for them to digest what the budget says, consider the proposals, and then write their legislation. We don't have the luxury of that time at this point, and I think that works in our favor. And the third point is, obviously, COSSA will be doing everything we can to stop that from happening. We lobby for SBE. That's central to our entire existence. So have no fear there. But we will be, calling on the community, engaging our champions in the Congress to stop this from happening. So if you hear requests from us in the coming weeks for stories or to sign a letter or whatever it might be, please do consider doing that, because we will be doing everything we can to prevent anything like that happening at the NSF this year.
We have a question in the chat from Ed. He says, could you say a bit more about the temperature in the room on the Hill visits last week? To what extent were they receptive to the argument that social science work is important? Did the subject of maintaining the integrity of the federal statistical agencies get raised in any of these meetings?
That's a great question. And we do have some folks who participated on the line. So if you want to chime in, Carolyn, I see you, about your particular meetings. What I will say in the aggregate, they're all different, but first, it was a very stressful day. It was also the day where with the intelligence hearings about the signal issue. So that was happening. The Dr. Oz confirmation hearing was happening. So Congress was stretched pretty thin, I will say that. So attention spans were short. But I find that in every meeting I go into, once we explain social science in terms that they're not used to, everyone thinks they know what social science is. Oh, I have an undergrad in political science, so I know what this is. But once we actually explain and we have the experts there to talk about it, it's much different, and they open up and they really appreciate when we ask them what they need, because rarely do constituents come in and say, how can I help you? Think about it. In congressional meetings, the reason you flew to Washington was to ask Congress for something. I need this money for a medical center, or this earmark for this purpose, or my child is sick with this disease and we need research at NIH for that specific purpose. But our asks are very open-ended, and that really does change the conversation. So if there's anyone else, Kenzie, too, you were in some meetings with the New York delegation, wanted to share what it felt like and how these offices were responding. And I'll just say before I do, statistical agencies was something that seemed to be getting a lot of attention on the Hill, too. We prepared our advocates to talk about the challenges to statistical agencies. And I got the sense that lots of congressional offices were not aware of statistical agencies, that they exist, and or the challenges that they're currently facing and the layoffs to those agencies and such. And so there was concern and interest in learning more. But Kenzie, Mary Jo, Carolyn, anyone else want to share?
Yeah, I'll just say really quick. I went to the New York, or I went with the New York State group. So of course, a lot of them were very supportive already. But one thing I did notice was when I was asking about their priorities, a lot of them didn't have much to say beyond the current situation that's happening with research funding and the budget cuts and the executive order. So it definitely seems as if this is, top of mind. So I definitely implore anyone that hasn't already contacted their offices to do that because they want to hear from their constituents about the impacts that they are experiencing. And that seems to be their top priority across the offices, at least that I went to.
I agree. This is Mary Jo with Population Association of America. I took around the Wisconsin, Michigan delegations, so I also had a very friendly reception in most of the meetings, and those that I was sort of dreading actually went really well. And staff, whether or not they were pulling the wool over our eyes, didn't know about the disappearing data, with the exception of one or two of the offices. So that was news to them, and wanting to be helpful and understand the implications, which my people were able to really speak, very clearly about, was helpful. We also got a lot of questions about indirect cost rate cuts to NIH awards and what the implications of those are. And my folks were prepared for that, which I was grateful for, because I can't answer on behalf broadly of the community. At least I didn't feel I was prepared, but my folks certainly could speak about their individual institutions. So I have an advocacy day on April 10th, and I'm prepping my folks to be prepared, because it is still very much a line of inquiry that staff want to pursue when you come to meet with them. And they also want the stories. I heard that all day long. We need to know the impacts.
Thank you. Carolyn?
Hi, everyone. I don't have much more to add from what's been said and what I put in the chat, but I will just say that the folks we met with, because we knew that our folks were already doing a lot of work on this front, we went in with sort of the strategy of how can we best support you? What do you need from us? How can we be a resource? And the folks we met with were especially interested in actionable things. So like the issue of the missing data. We particularly went in, we made a conscious choice to go in and really push this idea of congressionally mandated statistics, and we kind of pushed the narrative of we've paid for this with taxpayer money. This is our data. They're stealing it, and that kind of perked up some people. So yeah, that was my experience. But again, I'm fortunate to live in a place that is already kind of doing this work.
And you were the Virginia group, is that right?
Maryland.
Maryland. Yes, that was a good group too. So I think it was really helpful, even though some offices will say, "Hey, you're preaching to the choir," and we get that, but reminding them that we can help them give them the data they need to help make the case inside the House. So I think that was very worthwhile. Thank you all for sharing that. Any other questions about budgets or other things happening? I'll try to answer, but it's coming hard and fast, and so it's hard to keep up with a lot of this. All right, well, if not, stay tuned. Hopefully you'll all receive the COSSA Washington update tomorrow afternoon sometime. If you don't, get in touch, because we want to keep you informed, and we'll hopefully see you in a couple of weeks, and we'll give you the next update. Thanks so much. Take care.